Good evening, everybody. So excited for you all to join us tonight for this important event. My name is David Leviev. I am a Camera Campus Advisor, and I'm excited to welcome you all tonight. We have an exciting panel with three seasoned professionals in the Jewish and pro-Israel world who are going to share their experiences as Mizrahi Jews in America and also their family experiences in the Mizrahi world, in the state of Israel, and here in America, in North America. Before we get started, however, I want to make sure that we just set some housekeeping rules. So for all of our students who are joining us, welcome. We're excited to have you. It's important to remember that because we're in webinar format, you'll be needing to use the Q&A function. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. So throughout the talk tonight, even before we open up for Q&A, if you have some questions you want to ask, please submit them, and then we'll read them out to our panelists. Something else to note is the purpose of our event. So a big part of our event is to honor the life and stories and heritage of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews from across the Muslim world and the Iberian Peninsula. We have many different communities here, spanning a whole host of countries, languages, and cultures. And most importantly, cuisine as well. Never forget to bring up the cuisine of the different cultures. And also, just to know how we'll be starting for tonight, I'll begin briefly by sharing my family's story as Mizrahi Jews from the former Soviet Union. And then we will shift into our three panelists, who I'll introduce individually, and each will have 5 minutes to share their family stories and their stories as well. Then after that, we'll transition to talk about a few questions that we have prepared for our panelists before opening up for Q&A. Without further ado, I'll begin with my family's story and my community. So as I said, my name is David, and my community are the Kavkazi Mountain Jews of the Caucasus, better known as the Jews of the Caucasus, Gorsky Jews, many, many names for my community. I couldn't choose just one, so I'm gonna call my community Kavkazi Mountain Jews. One or the other is known by many American Jews who've gotten to know our community. So for my family's story, most of my family lived in Dagestan, which is a republic within the Russian Federation, particularly in cities such as Derbent and Makhachkala. I've also had family from Kabardino-Balkaria and cities like Nalchik. And it's also important to mention that while it's not my story, part of the story of the Kavkazi Jewish people include the Republic of Azerbaijan, including Krasnaya Sloboda, which is an all-Jewish town, and also the capital city of Baku. My family story starts in America when my father's side decided to leave during the Soviet Union and immigrated first to Italy before heading to Israel and then finally to the United States. This all occurred in the late 1970s. For my mother's side, they stayed in the Soviet Union much longer in Dagestan and then left to make aliyah to the state of Israel, like millions of Soviet Jews would eventually make. What's distinct about my community compared to other communities is that in the Soviet Union is that we're one of 3 Sephardic Mizrahi communities and in a region that's predominantly Ashkenazi. So we're Mizrahi Jews who also speak Russian. Particularly with Kavkazi Jews, we originate from Persian Jews after leaving the land of Israel. And it's also important to note the connection between Kavkazi Jews and the land and the state of Israel run very deep. And some Kavkazi Jews have been making aliyah since the 1860s. So that's just a little bit about my story. It's important to note that the diversity of the Mizrahi tent is very vast and very large. It spans many different places. All 3 of our panelists represent a part of this mosaic, which is of course a part of an even bigger mosaic of the Jewish world. No aspect of the Jewish community, whether one is Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, or a Jew by choice, is the same. Each community and each person has their valid perspective and narrative. So that's just a little bit about that and a little bit about what our event will be like. For those of you watching on Facebook Live or on Twitter, you can share our story and our conversation here by sharing the Facebook Live link and also writing the hashtag Mizrahi Stories. Let's help spread the word of the Jewish people and the true diversity of our community. So I'm excited to start with our first panelist, Rena Nasar First. She is the Executive Director of the Campus Affairs Department at StandWithUs. Her family are Syrian Jews, and she'll share the story of her community and her family. Thanks so much for joining us, Rena.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Camera on Campus. I am so excited to be here. It's so nice to see people other than my husband. I'm newly married. It just hit the year mark. What an interesting year to get to know each other during COVID. So it's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I work for Stand With Us, an international Israel education organization. Here at Stand With Us, we are inspired by our love of Israel, our belief that education is the road to peace, and our commitment to stand up for Israel and the Jewish people. I grew up in the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. Apparently I have an accent. I don't really hear it. You might hear it. I don't know. This is just, to me, what everyone around me sounds like. Often, many of us stand on the shoulders of those before us, and the same goes for me and my Syrian family. My family has been in Syria since the exiles in ancient Israel, so we've really been there a long time. And I know I really look Mizrahi, right? I totally have the complexion, the coloring, but that's what's so amazing about Mizrahi Jews, that even as a category, we all look so different. We're all from different places. Our families all have different journeys. My story really starts with my Jiddah. Jiddah is grandfather in Arabic. My Jiddah was born in Aleppo, and he was part of the thriving Jewish community in Aleppo. What's interesting in Syria is you have two different communities that were largely either in Aleppo or Damascus. Each community thought they were better than the other one, but either way, they really built an incredible lives for themselves, incredible communities. After France pulled out of Syria around 1944, 1945, the Jewish community started to notice a dramatic shift in what was going on. All of a sudden, there were boycotts against their businesses, physical attacks against their businesses. Teaching Hebrew was forbidden. Emigrating to Palestine was forbidden. There was this real shift in the environment where the Syrian Jewish community knew something is going to happen. It's not going to be good. We need to do something about it. My grandfather, along with many other Jews at the time in Syria, decided that they needed to flee. My grandfather and his family of 9 siblings decided they were going to split into different groups because they didn't know if everyone would survive the journey. Splitting up into groups is the only way they can guarantee that some of them would make it safely to Israel. They left food on the stove to make it seem like they were coming back, and they left all their possessions behind to really make it seem like they had just stepped out to pick up some milk. Their family in these different groups, with so many other Syrian Jews, fled by foot. It was a journey that took 20 hours from Syria through Lebanon, and then finally getting to Israel. What's even more crazy to think about, aside from that journey in and of itself, is that the minute these Jews got to Israel, they knew that their journey wasn't over. They knew that their fight for their safety wasn't over. Within unrest in Israel itself, my grandfather picked up arms because he knew what Israel meant to him, his family, and his community, and that if Israel was in danger, he needed to fight. In the War of Independence, in the War of 1948, my grandfather fought as a sergeant major in the Givati Brigade. What he would always tell us is that the men in his unit all spoke different languages. They had makeshift uniforms, and they had very few bullets, which meant that everything they needed to do had to be specific and targeted because they only had one chance to do it right. All that we know about 48 and just hearing stories from my grandfather, it really seemed like this was a war that the Jews should not have won. My grandfather would love to say that in this war, he saw the hand of God. He saw a miracle happen. And I think it's largely because the Jewish community knew what they needed to do. They knew what was at stake, just as my grandfather did. After the tremendous victory of 48, my grandfather actually served in the foreign ministry because he spoke Arabic. He was someone that was very valuable, and he loved being valuable. He loved contributing to the country in so many ways. After a few years of continuing his service, he decided to move to America and join the Jewish community in Brooklyn, the Syrian Jewish community in Brooklyn. The community now is around 70,000 strong, mostly in Brooklyn, also in New Jersey, and really spread in all other pockets of the world. It's a vibrant community with rich culture, traditions, and fierce loyalty. And a lot of what I learned from my grandfather inspired me to take on this role in Israel activism. It inspired me to be an activist in high school, to be an activist in college, and to work in this career professionally so that I can fight for Israel just like my Jiddo did.
Thank you so much, Rena, for sharing your story and your community's story. The pride and the tradition of the Syrian Jewish community definitely adds to the broad and diverse tent of the Mizrahi world. And as somebody also from Brooklyn, maybe it's not us who have the accents, maybe it's the rest of the country, because I also don't hear it.
I agree. I agree.
The best borough, though. So for our next guest, I want to introduce Hait Gilad, who is the National Program Director at IAC Mishelanu. Hait has a very interesting and important narrative as somebody who is both Israeli and lives in the United States, and also comes from a diverse set of narratives in the Mizrahi world. This includes the Yemeni community and the Turkish community. Thank you for joining us. Really excited to have you and really excited to hear what you have to say and contribute.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Camera on Campus. I'm really excited to share my family story. I have to say that it's been a while since I had the opportunity to share it, and again, thank you for that. As you mentioned, my story divides to two, through my mom's side and my dad's side. And I'll start with my mom's side on a very exciting operation called the Magic Carpet, when the Yemen community made Aliyah to Israel. My family from my mom's side lived in a city called Sana'a in Yemen. They were part of a Jewish community when all the community was almost the same level of poverty, I have to say. They lived in very basic homes, lived very basic life, and they had a good life until somebody became an orphan or a widow. And then by law in Yemen, you had to marry in Islam, an Islamic groom. And that was part of their fear. The other reason when they wanted and dreamed about the land of Israel is that the poverty in Yemen, the healthcare in Yemen were crucial. People lost their life very easily, and he was kind of a hope for a new beginning when David Ben-Gurion reached out and through the Jewish agency started to help the Jewish community in Yemen to make Aliyah. So my grandfather and my grandmother made Aliyah with 2 kids out of 10. They had a long road to go until they reached Israel. When they arrived to Israel, they were moved to Tel Aviv, to a neighborhood called Ramat Israel, and they started a life of a struggle. My grandfather had to work 3 jobs in order to provide for the family of 10 kids. They lived in a very basic home, but a very loving family. The parents were strict. I guess part of the Mizrahi narrative in Israel is about, keeping your kids out of crime because of the poverty of the homes. So they're very strict parents. They were very strict about where their kids are, who are they hanging out with. And they succeed to create a very loving and wonderful family. Unfortunately, part of the family story is that one of the children that my grandmother gave birth was sick at the age of 4 months, and she had to take him to the hospital. And the day after she brought him to the hospital, she came back to visit him, and they said that he passed away. They never showed her where their body is, and she never knew what really happened. So part of our story is being part of the mystery of the missing kids of Yemen. My mom remembered that baby, and she remembered my grandmother crying and extremely sad for losing a child that she couldn't even bury. Unfortunately, because they didn't speak the language very well, and they felt, I said, powerless. So they couldn't struggle, or they couldn't look for the right answer, and they just had to take that for an answer and continue with their lives. And you know, as Israel grown, as the country developed, and they heard more and more stories that are very similar to that story. They all had the same narrative of a sick child that the parents brought to the hospital and came back the other day, and they were told that he passed away. So that is part of our family. But besides that, I grew up to a very warm, happy Yemen family filled with stories, good food, singing, dancing. And when I got to kind of plan my wedding, me and my husband, which is Ashkenazi, decided to celebrate the China ceremony, which is an authentic engagement ceremony. And we dressed as Yemen, and we had the China with all the songs and the food. And I have to say that, you know, part of that experience of getting married was one of the most emotional moments for me, to go back to my roots and even, you know, join my husband in that family story. So this is just 50% of me. And the other 50% is that I'm Turkish. My father was born in Istanbul, on the contrary to a family that was wealthy, and felt very comfortable in Turkey, but was also very Zionist. And after his bar mitzvah, when he was 13, the whole family decided to make aliyah, and they went on a ship and they sailed to Israel. And like in the stories, he saw the Jaffa port in front of him as he was sailing to Israel, and they were singing. They settled in Ramat Gan, and the parents who were wealthy couldn't reach that same level as Turkey. And unfortunately, the father passed away kind of early. So my father, which was the oldest, decided to give up his high school studies and to provide for the family. And I have my Turkish amazing side, also a very warm, loving family of 3 brothers. There are 3 brothers. I have to say that the Turkish people are good and warm and knows how to express. If you see those Turkish series, they're very dramatic. They know how to express their feeling very, very extremely. But yeah, this is my story. I'm enjoying both beautiful families. So thank you, David, for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Hait, for sharing both sides of your family's story. And I truly appreciate the way you shared both family stories. Humanizing and personalizing the Mizrahi story is something that I personally believe is very effective to engaging the broader public. And also, you know, I think something that people don't know is the diversity of the Muslim world in general. I think a lot of people still perceive the Arab world to be the only parts of the Muslim world, but the Ottoman world, the former Ottoman world, and the Persian world, and so many different other elements. And then, of course, the touching story, the sad, tragic story you told about the Yemenite children. Super important to have that full conversation, to get that full history, and honoring the full memory of these communities that we all come from. So thank you for that. And now I'm also very excited. Last but not least, our final panelist for this evening is Yael Brenner, the Assistant Director at the Hillel at Baruch City, John J. Case, SVA, Fordham, FIT, and the New School, representing a whole host of New York City area schools. And she comes from the Iraqi Jewish community. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, David and Camera, for putting this together and giving me the opportunity to share my family story. My grandparents were born in Iraq. Iraq has a long Jewish history. Jews were in Iraq for thousands of years since the Babylonian exile. My grandparents were born in the early 30s. My grandfather is from Baghdad and my grandmother is from Basra, two main cities in Iraq. And they both share pretty positive memories of their childhood. They both went to Jewish elementary schools. My grandfather tells stories about going swimming in the Tigris River. My grandmother's family had a huge house in Basra with a courtyard in the middle. They were always hosting guests, having people over. My grandmother's father would often travel to India for business. And so there's a lot of positive memories from the earlier days. But unfortunately that took a turn, mostly with an event called the Farhud, which took place in 1941. It was essentially a pogrom that took place over the holiday of Shavuot, where more than 180 Iraqi Jews were killed. One of those was my grandfather's aunt. But thankfully, my grandparents' families were protected during the Farhud. My grandfather's family was actually protected by a Muslim Iraqi friend. My grandfather's father had a very good friend, and thanks to him, they were protected during the Farhud. They actually came over. My grandfather's father's friend brought his wife and his children over to my grandfather's house early in the morning, and they stayed there with them for the entire day. And whenever someone would come and knock on the door and try to break in and cause harm to my grandfather's family, this Muslim friend would open the door and essentially deny that any Jewish people were living there and protected them. A few years later, when my grandfather was a teenager, he joined a Zionist youth movement, an underground movement, where they would meet once a week, a few teenagers together to learn Hebrew, learn about Israel. They learned Hebrew songs, and they met on a pretty regular basis until one day in 1949, my grandfather's cousin, who was also a part of this Zionist underground movement, was caught and arrested. She was sent to prison for 7 years just for being a part of this movement. And after that took place, my grandfather's father essentially, told my grandfather that he needed to leave Iraq immediately, that this was not a safe place to be, not a safe place for Jewish people, and that he needed to leave. So in December of 1949, just 3 days after his cousin was arrested, my grandfather then traveled actually to my grandmother's family. They're distant cousins, so they knew each other. And my grandmother's family helped my grandfather to escape from Iraq, actually through Iran, which at the time was a good and safe place for Jewish people. So my grandmother's family provided my grandfather, with some money and valuables to help bribe guards and people along the way until they finally got to Iran. And then with a small group of other refugees from Iraq, they traveled 2 different places in Iran, sleeping on floors of synagogues until they finally got to Tehran, where there was sort of an organized situation by the Jewish Agency, which then eventually organized a flight to Israel, for all of these refugees that had come from Iraq. So my grandfather then flew to Israel thanks to this organized effort. He spent his first couple of weeks in Israel living in a tent. Israel was a very young country. Things were difficult. Food was rationed. And after a couple of weeks of living in a tent, my grandfather got up and said, it's time to enlist in the army, and, put into action all of what he had learned in the Zionist undergrad when he was back in Iraq. But when he went to go enlist, they actually told him that he had to wait a whole year. He had to be in Israel for a year before he could actually enlist into the IDF. And so that year, which was very difficult, he worked in random jobs like construction until he was actually allowed to enlist. When he did, he started to serve in the Air Force, which he then eventually served in for 25 years. To backtrack a little bit, my grandfather came earlier than the rest of his family and also my grandmother's family. A few years after he did, they also all escaped from Iraq. My grandfather's family came to Israel not long after him. My grandmother's family also went through Iran, but they actually stayed in Iran for quite a few years after they left Iraq before they came to Israel. Also, they had to leave everything that they had, the beautiful house with the courtyard, my great-grandfather's business. They couldn't sell anything because it would show a sign that they were going to escape. So they just left everything and took all the valuables that they could in order to bribe people on the way throughout their escape. So my grandmother's family then settled in Iran for a little while. My grandmother eventually came to Israel a little bit earlier than the rest of her family to marry my grandfather. My grandfather sent a letter to my grandmother's father to ask for permission to marry her, and she came to Israel and they got married, and the rest of her family came a little bit later. I'll just finish with one story that I always like to share because I think it's a fun one. When my grandfather came to Israel, and he came to the absorption center to put down all of his information. So basic question, they ask him, okay, what's your name? So his name is David. So he said his name is David. And they said, okay, what's your last name? And he said, well, I don't exactly have a last name because it's not really the way it worked in Iraq. You kind of just associated by your father, your grandfather's name. And they said, okay, fine. So what's your grandfather's name? So his grandfather's name was David. So to this day, my grandfather's name is David. And actually, like I said before, the rest of his family came a little bit later. And when they came, with my great-grandfather gave the name of his grandfather, which was Shimon. And so they actually have different last names because they gave different last names of different grandfathers. But my grandparents still live in Israel, and they were always proud and continue to be proud to live there, and I'm proud that they live there and to live on the Zionist mission and aspirations that my grandfather had all the way back from when he was in Iraq all the way till today.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that, Yael. That last story is really awesome. I think David is a very good first name, last name combo. I also think it's so important that you mentioned the contributions to the Zionist underground and also, the bravery of Muslim neighbors, even during such difficult times for the Jewish people. Just like for Ashkenazi Jews who dealt with unimaginable pain during the Holocaust, and they were the righteous among nations there. The same is also true in parts of the Muslim world, where, as you mentioned, many grandparents from across our families have fond memories of their neighbors and the countries that they come from. So I thank you for sharing those stories. They're stories that people don't hear often enough. So what our next step will be is that we're going to enter the Q&A portion. But before we open up to questions from the audience, and I see we're getting a few, I'm going to ask one individual question to each of our panel members. So for our first question, we'll go to Rena. And this one is based on your personal and individual experiences. And will be the theme for these next few questions for our panel. How has your upbringing as a Mizrahi woman of Syrian Jewish descent in Brooklyn and New York, how has that impacted you as somebody going through high school and college, and as you entered the professional field? I know you mentioned it a little bit earlier, your inspiration for going into the pro-Israel and Jewish world professionally. I think it'd be interesting for our students to know a little bit more about that.
My whole life, until high school, I was surrounded by people who had very similar backgrounds to me. We had the same traditions, we had the same practices and customs, we had the same shared experience of knowing what our families went through, what they sacrificed to get us here. And staying connected, staying close, physically, emotionally, spiritually, were huge priorities for us growing up, and for me specifically growing up. Even when I went to high school, I was still part of the Syrian community. I went to Yeshiva Flatbush, which when I was in school was largely Syrian. There were some Ashkenaz Jews, but they really made up a minority of the demographic within my school. So naturally, I felt always comforted knowing I'm part of this community. They're with me wherever I go. I see them wherever I go. And this mission that I took upon myself to fight for Israel, like my Jiddo did, seemed very easy being part of a very Zionist community that cares so much about Israel, that sends money to Israel, that visits Israel all the time. And so when I got to college, I thought things would be similar. And all of a sudden, I'm meeting Jews from all different backgrounds. I'm no longer the majority. I'm in the minority, even at Baruch, which has a vibrant Mizrahi Jewish community. And I start meeting non-Jews also. I start interacting with them in my classes. I start making friends. It was a completely new environment for me. It was one that was very intimidating at first, but soon became very exciting. And all of a sudden now I had an opportunity to teach people about Mizrahi Jews, to teach people about Syrian Jews, what this culture, what this community is all about. I remember, well, first I would want to say that Hillel at Baruch, which was my home base, gave me this opportunity in so many ways to really grow as a leader, to really share that story, my story, in whatever way I saw fit. And that was incredible in my growth as a leader. In that same trajectory, I actually decided to take Arabic language classes. I only knew slang and some curse words that I really shouldn't know in Arabic. So I said, you know what, let me study the language and be able to speak to my Jiddo on his mother tongue. I can't even imagine the wealth of stories and information that I would be able to get just being able to speak to my Jiddo in his home language. And I remember immediately noticing one of the few non-Muslims in the class, but that's okay. I'm here to meet new people. This is super exciting. My professor had shared a few weeks into the class that, or like pretty early on in the class, she shared that Arabic was a beautiful language, rich in culture and history. And then any other language that's spoken in the Middle East really doesn't belong there. And maybe one day, if we're lucky, it won't be there anymore. I don't know how other people understood what she said in the class. To me, it was immediate what she's trying to say. She doesn't know I'm Jewish, but I know what she's trying to say. And that was my moment to finally fight for Israel like my Jiddo had. I had been doing all these amazing things through Hillel, these amazing programs. And this was my time to really take that a step further. And I couldn't do anything with it. I was silent. My face turned red. My stomach dropped to my shoes. And I just sat quietly. And I showed up to class again and again and again, thinking maybe this is the time I'm going to say something. Maybe this is the time I'm going to stand up. And each time I couldn't do it. And it really taught me a very important lesson that loving Israel and having that connection, having it be a critical part of your identity is just not enough. My grandfather had very few weapons, but look what he did out of it. Look what all the Jews who fought in 48 did in that situation where all the odds were skewed against them. Look what they were able to do. It taught me that I need to arm myself. I need to have those tools. I need to have those resources. I need the facts. I need the confidence, because that's how I'm truly going to make a difference. That's how I'm truly going to fight for Israel and protect her the same way she protected my Jidda, and in turn, he protected her. And that really drew me so much closer, not only to this field professionally, but to my Mizrahi heritage, that I owed it to him and to my community to do better and to be better. It's a story that honestly is a failure, right? It's not a successful story. It's not something I was able to overcome in that time, in that moment, but it drives everything I do every single day, as now is about giving back to make sure that there won't be students in that same situation.
Thank you so much, Rena. That is so incredibly inspirational. That story at Baruch, I think it's stunning, but also I think says the reality that how little people know about the Jewish world of those countries. Even people whose families come from those countries, if they're Muslim or Christian, they may not know as much about the Jewish civilizations that their grandparents or great-grandparents may have interacted with. So I'm really glad you shared that story. I think it's super important to add on to the narrative. So for our next question, our next individual question, this one will go to Hait. You mentioned that you grew up in Ramat Gan, which I think for those of us who know Israel, and even where my family lives in Israel, I don't think most people assume that Mizrahi Jews would live in right outside of Tel Aviv, that they would live in the periphery or in the south. So I'm sure you'll have an interesting perspective on that. So I want to know a little bit more about that, and then also knowing your experience being Mizrahi in the army, in the IDF.
Sure. So I have to say, first of all, Ramat Gan is a very Iraqi city. Between the several people that are not Iraqi in Ramat Gan, but you're absolutely right. It's in the center of Israel, and I'm relating to what Rena said. I lived in a bubble when we're all equal. I had a childhood that I spent with people that are equal to me. The possibilities were endless. I felt like I can do anything. I have all the options in the world. I took major in high school as a theater, and I was a basketball player in high school. I could have do anything. And then I reached the army, and you're being thrown to the reality and the mixture of the Israeli society. I was an infantry instructor, so I met all kinds of Israelis that I never met before on a personal basis. And my base was next to Yerucham. And then I found out that there is a difference, and there's a huge gap in the possibilities of, I will say, especially Mizrahi, because Mizrahi, again, my family was never settled, in the periphery. It was always, in the center of Israel. My mom in Tel Aviv, my dad's side in Ramat Gan, but most of the Mizrahi immigrants are settled in south of Israel, when there's just sand and tents and school in a low level. And I'll give some examples. In my high school, you could have chose any major that you're interested in, from dance to theater to movies to music to chemistry, And you don't have these kind of options when you go to high school in the south of Israel or the periphery of Israel, south or north. High school there don't get the funds that the high schools in the center of Israel gets. You don't get the opportunity to go on a delegation to Poland. Or maybe you do, but you don't get any funds that help you reach that amount that you can go on a delegation to Poland. And again, the people that they meet, the interactions that they have, the experience that they have. I was part of the Scouts. Around me, I had like endless of opportunities, endless of youth movements, and the cities, they cannot fund the youth movements on these cities. So you basically in the afternoon don't get any options of afternoon activities, and you grow up as a person that has less and less interactions or opportunities to see your horizon as somebody that can reach the highest places or the highest positions. Again, until you get to the army, and then you start to compare. Until then, you don't know as a child, but when you get to the army, you start to compare. And I have to say that it exists. I know that it's an endless battle to try and make education in the periphery to be equal as in the center of Israel, but unfortunately, it's not there yet. And we all know that education is the base of who are you, or the foundation of who are you as a person. And I can only wish that this is something that the government will put focus on reaching that gap of possibilities in the periphery. So the kids that are growing there will feel like I felt, like I can choose and do whatever I wished as a kid.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think you touched upon a lot of things that not only relate to, I think, a lot of Israelis of Mizrahi descent or coming from the periphery or from the South, the education gap, but also in the United States, regardless of religion, you know, the differences between rural and urban and suburban education. It's such an important topic that you brought up. And for all of us on this panel, you know, we're in the work of educating people and engaging with people. So I'm really grateful that you brought that up as well. Thank you so much. And now we're going to go into our final individual question before opening up to Q&A. I see we have some questions waiting there for us. But before we do, Yael, I know you were talking to me earlier before the panel, you know, growing up in a majority Ashkenazi community, you know, that's an experience many Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in America have experienced. I know for me personally, I was born in Brooklyn, but I left the bubble, the Russian-speaking bubble, whether it's Kafkazi or Russian or Bukharian, leaving that bubble in New York City and moving to North Carolina, where I can tell you there's not too many Kafkazi Jews down there, not too many Jews in general down there. So I'd love to hear your experience in a different bubble, in a majority Ashkenazi bubble in New Jersey.
Sure. Thanks, David. So my experience is kind of the opposite of what Rena was sharing. You know, Rena was sharing that she grew up, you know, in a Syrian community, went to a Syrian school, and kind of you're constantly surrounded by that community and by that experience. I grew up in a predominantly Ashkenazi Jewish community. I went to a day school, an Orthodox day school, which was predominantly Ashkenazi. The synagogue we went to was Ashkenazi. You know, pretty much everywhere I went, I was the minority in terms of being Mizrahi. You know, we had a few family friends in the community that came from a variety of Mizrahi countries, but even within that community, it wasn't like an Iraqi community. It was just like a blend of different Mizrahi families. So I never really had the opportunity to be a part of an actual Iraqi Jewish community. Or, you know, have any sort of formal Jewish education that was Sephardic or Mizrahi. Like I said, I went to a day school, which was predominantly Ashkenazi, which means that, when we learned about the traditions, when we learned how to pronounce certain words, when we learned about aspects of Jewish law, those were all from an Ashkenazi lens. And really my only outlet or opportunity to be a part of an Iraqi Jewish community was with family. And I think, that's also why my personal connection to Judaism is so connected to family, and being a part of that. So there were definitely instances of, like, what, you eat rice on Passover? Like, you're not allowed to do that, or that's weird. And, that doesn't make sense. And, kind of always having to explain different things, or being the representative, and kind of just, always going through that. And, I never really had the opportunity to experience, really intensive Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities until I started working at Hillel, which Rena also spoke about. But I never really realized that there were these communities in New York where people lived amongst Persian Jews or Syrian Jews or Bukharian Jews, and kind of realizing that I missed out on that opportunity a little bit. So there were definitely challenges, but there were also a lot of opportunities to educate the larger Jewish community about our experience, and about our traditions and the way that we practice.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I love that, being the representative, having the opportunity to showcase, and also getting to decide if we want to humbly brag or very much openly brag about being able to eat rice on Passover. But I love that. I think it's important, to hear that perspective, because in general, across the Jewish spectrum in the United States, there are many Jews who try and muster the courage to even just express any Jewish identity. The more Jewish voices from the Sephardic and Mizrahi space that are openly expressing their identities, the more it empowers our entire Jewish community. So thank you so much for that. And now, as promised, we'll go into the question and answer section of our audience. And I'm going to ask a question from one of our wonderful camera student fellows, Eden Janfer from Binghamton University in New York State. And he asked, this is for all of you, what do you think is the most glaring misconception about Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews today? And anyone can start off first. We could start with Rena, or we can, whoever wants to answer that question first.
There are many misconceptions you could point to. To me, the biggest gap is just the lack of information, which that's, if you think about it, the misconception is the symptom, whereas the real core problem is not knowing enough. It's that lack of information. That's where that gap is. And I think, to something Yael mentioned earlier, that the way you fix that problem, the way you fill that gap, is by taking as much time as you can to explore the different approaches, explore the different traditions, even the way like a Shabbat service is run on campus. Maybe one is more of an Ashkenaz service, the next one's more of a Sephardic service. So to me, it's not so much the misconceptions themselves that are the problem. It's a symptom of that lack of education.
Thank you so much, Rena. Does anyone else want to answer that question, or would we like to move on to the next one?
I agree. We can go to the next one.
Awesome. Sounds great. So our next question is from Millie. And Millie's question is, what have your families done to help maintain traditions from the countries that your families originate from? And this is, again, for anyone who wants to answer.
I mentioned the China ceremony, which is kind of an engagement ceremony. And I I think every female cousin that I have through a Hina ceremony. So it was one way to maintain it. And I have, well, my grandmother is not with us anymore, but I have her songs and her cooking as a part of me while she was cooking. So she kind of made that atmosphere as part of our childhood memories that are so wrapped in our lives that help us maintain that.
I definitely want to echo the henna tradition. I, like Rena, got married recently as well. But actually the henna tradition was kind of lost a little bit in our family. And it was a really special opportunity for, when I got married and we did a henna ceremony, we were kind of bringing back that tradition into our family, which was a really amazing opportunity. But some other ways that, I think for us, the tradition is mostly focused on holidays, and the different foods that we eat and the different traditions that we have. My mom is actually Ashkenazi. My mom's family is Ashkenazi, but at the Passover Seder, we have everything from both traditions. So we have two types of charoset, and we have salt water and lemon juice to dip the karpas in, and kind of just making sure that all of those are still there. But again, a lot of it comes down to the way we celebrate holidays.
Thank you for that. And then I'll also add in something there as well. I saw somebody personally ask me a question, so it kind of relates to this one, so I'll knock it out. Two birds with one stone here. For me, especially because my family moved to North Carolina, exactly not too much of a Kafkazi infrastructure there. I give credit to my parents' grit, and my grandparents' grit. And, in the South especially, you learn to get a lot of grit or eat a lot of grits, for those of you from the South. But, in my family, we didn't go to synagogue a lot in North Carolina. We would go to a few Chabad things on high holidays, but at the home, we would always eat Kafkazi food, whether it's chudo or kurzei or chebureki or the many, many desserts. All of the foods of my culture, my family's culture, stayed alive in our home. And I especially, want to give a shout out to my great grandmother, Baba Vera, who moved here a few years ago from Israel. And, she's very old country, very, very Kafkazi in everything she does. And sometimes, she'll sing some of the songs from the old country. And for me, that's, it kind of makes me emotional because, you see that culture is still alive. And kind of like what everyone has echoed here, the idea that, our families are so central to our Jewish identity. They're so central to who we are. And that helps preserve a lot of those traditions. So the next question that I'm going to ask will be from, there's two questions actually that kind of touch upon this, and we talked about education a few times. And so one of them is from Aiden Siegel, our fellow at University of Pittsburgh. And then another one, I believe, was anonymous. And they both ask if there are movies, books, documentaries, websites, organizations that you would recommend to learn more about Mizrahi Jews and Sephardic Jews. I'll just bring up one myself, Jemena, one of our co-sponsors for this event. Very important and great organization, and they do a lot in the education space here. And I'll open it up to one of you three or any of you three who want to answer it as well.
There's an incredible resource here called the Sephardic Heritage Museum. They have an Instagram account, they have a website. They've actually created a film series documenting the journey of the Syrian Jews from Aleppo and Damascus to America. And what's interesting is they kind of did it like Star Wars, where it starts with episode 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and one is going to come out soon as like the finale. But I believe you can access all those films on their website. You can also see pictures. They collect pictures from the community. from their journeys. There are pictures of my Jiddo that are featured on the site. It's always exciting that anytime I Google his name, it's one of the first links that come up. So I would definitely recommend the Sephardic Heritage Museum. And if you are interested in some of the cuisine, there's an incredible cookbook called Aromas of Aleppo that has some of the amazing, delicious Syrian recipes, all tied heavily into history. So it's a history cookbook.
Awesome. Would anyone else like to share on this question, or are we ready for another question? I think we touched upon a lot of good sources here. Awesome. So another question, let's see. Another question that somebody wrote, and this is in reference to a few comments from a bunch of us. An anonymous attendee wrote, when you say the Muslim world, did you mean Middle Eastern, or can you clarify? So let me know who wants to take that one. I think it's a very good question, very important question, especially for those who don't know a lot about the broader Muslim world. I can take it quickly if nobody else wants to answer it. So what I mean by the broader Muslim world, it includes the Persian world, so Iran and countries influenced by Iran. It includes the Arab world in the Middle East and North Africa, and also the former Ottoman Empire, so Turkey. And the reason I use the word Muslim world is because the Mizrahi experience is very diverse and touches upon so many different regions of the world that I think it's more inclusive as a catch-all for such a broad term. And you could talk to other members of the Mizrahi world who will point out that Mizrahi often refers to being east, but then there's countries like Morocco that are actually west of places like Poland. So it's a very interesting, I think, conversation in terms of what we mean by defining Mizrahi and Sephardi and all these terms. And it actually leads me up to another question that I think could be really relevant to this. In this community, there's a lot of debate between Sephardi or Mizrahi, one or the other or both. So, I think for people who aren't familiar with these terms, for many people, Sephardi often refers to a certain style of prayer or people directly from the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Portugal and Spain and the descendants of those Jews. While for some, Mizrahi refers people directly from the Arab world, directly from the Persian world. But there are many different definitions, and for many people, these terms are interchangeable. For me, I interchange them. And I know for families, there's sometimes a generational gap between the term usage. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to answer that question real quickly.
I can, Hait,
Go ahead, Yael.
So I think that they're two separate things, and I think that they should be used differently based on the context. Just from my, my personal identity and experience, I don't really identify as a Sephardic Jew. I identify as a Mizrahi Jew. Iraqi Jews didn't come from Spain or Portugal. Iraqi Jews were in Iraq from, the Babylonian exile, for thousands of years. The Babylonian Talmud was written in modern day Iraq. So, personally, I identified definitely as Mizrahi, and I think that Sephardic doesn't quite cover it.
I'll just add that for me, touches both because the roots of my father's family are from Spain. So they prayed in Ladino and they spoke Ladino. So part of it's Sephardi, but definitely the Yemen side is a Mizrahi.
Awesome. Thank you for touching upon that. Like I said earlier, it's, you have kind of both of these narratives, as you mentioned, two different worlds within the broader tent community. And then thank you, Yael, also for sharing your experience as well, because it's a very passionate topic of conversation. Rena, would you like to answer it too, or ready to move on? Just want to make sure I give you a chance if you want to.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll just add something quick. I mean, labels are labels, but it goes so much deeper than that. So even in someone just giving you these identifiers, whichever ones they choose, I mean, you'd be missing out on a major opportunity if you just took them at face value and you said, okay, this person's Sephardic, okay, this person's Mizrahi. You could hear from 3 of us, and we're only 3 people, how deep these stories go, how deep these identities go, what they mean to us, what they mean to the Jewish world as a whole. So to me, it's definitely important to make sure you're using the right terminology, but dig deeper than the label, because there's so much more to explore.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think that question is a great one to leave off the conversation. And I say leave off because I don't think this is a conversation that could really end. I think it's a conversation we have on campuses with our students, with our families at home, with our friends, and then for me, and I know maybe for some other people too, sometimes strangers who've never even heard of these communities, who have no connection to the Jewish peoplehood, just because it's a fun conversation. It's a pride of what we do and who we are. So I think this will be a great way to leave off this conversation, virtually return to our campuses, especially now. Please wear a mask and stay safe for everyone. But I also want to thank all of our sponsors, the IAC, the Hillel, the SUNY colleges, Stand With Us, and Jimena. And of course, I want to thank Camera on Campus for giving me the opportunity to lead this discussion, our panelists for coming on and sharing their stories, and our students for doing the important work that they do every day for the Jewish people, for the US-Israel relationship, and for truth telling when it comes to the Middle East.